Okay, moving then as quickly as possible into our subject matter for today. We begin a series of lectures on various aspects of 20th century formalism, a big word at the end of our run through the varieties of 20th century formalism. I hope it doesn't seem quite as big and that its many meanings, but finite number of meanings, have been made clear to you. In the meantime, this aspect of our subject that is to say, what we're taking up this week is as much really, you remember in the first lecture I said there's a difference between the history of criticism and theory of literature. One difference being history of criticism has a great deal to do with literary evaluation. That is to say, why do we care about literature and how can we find means of saying that it's good or not good? This is an aspect of thought concerning literature that tends to fall out of literary theory, but not out of the materials that we're reading this week. You can see that when Wimsatt and Beardsley talk about the success of the poem, they understand the whole critical enterprise, including its theoretical underpinnings, the question, what is a poem, the question, how should we best read it, that the whole enterprise is still geared toward literary evaluation. And that makes this subject matter that we'll be discussing this week, as I say, as much a part of the history of criticism as it is of literary theory. We're going to be reading it with a theory spin. That is to say, we're going to focus on the question what a poem is and the question what criteria should we invoke in order to read it for the best and correctly. But there are other ways of approaching this material. In any case, Wimsatt, Beardsley was actually a philosopher who taught at Temple University, a good friend of his. In the book in which the essay, The Intentional Fallacy, appeared, a book called The Verbal Icon, Wimsatt collaborated with Monroe Beardsley on 3 essays, and this is one of them. So we try to remember to say Wimsatt and Beardsley, even though it is Wimsatt who taught at Yale. That in itself needn't be significant, except that the new critics, the school of critics to which he belonged, have always been identified with Yale and indeed consolidated a kind of teaching method and attitude toward literature which constituted the first wave, first of 2 waves of involvement in literary theory, which amount to the Yale English and Comparative Literature Department's claims to fame. The new critics, many of those figures who belonged to the new critics did much of their important work before they arrived at Yale. Others never were at Yale, and yet at the same time it's a movement closely associated with this institution. When I arrived at Yale, Wimsatt was still teaching, Cleanth Brooks was still teaching, and so I feel a kind of personal continuity with these figures and understand, as we all will more fully later on, the way in which the style and emphasis on style of close reading that evolved within the new criticism meaningfully and importantly left its mark on much subsequent criticism and theory that hasn't, in fact, always acknowledged the new criticism, perhaps to the extent that it might have. What I'll say, because much of this should be reserved for next time when I talk about Cleanth Brooks and return to the whole subject of the new criticism and the way in which it's viewed historically. So much of it can be reserved for next time. But what I do want to say now is this. If it weren't for the new critics, none of you probably would have been able to sit patiently through any of your middle or high school English classes. When Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren published a book called Understanding Poetry, first published 1939, and then subsequently reissued again and again and again as it swept the country, suddenly school teachers had a way of keeping kids in the classroom for 50 minutes. Close reading, the idea that you could take a text and do things with it, that the interpretation of a text wasn't just a matter of saying, oh yes, it's about this, and isn't it beautiful? Reciting the text, emoting over it, enthusing about it, and then looking around for something else to say. It was no longer a question of doing that. It was a question of constructing an elaborate formal edifice to which everybody could contribute. Students got excited about it. They saw certain patterns or certain ways of elaborating patterns that the teachers were talking about. And lo and behold, the 50 minutes was over. And everybody had had a pretty good time. This had never happened in an English class before. Seriously, you're English majors because of the new criticism. I admit, especially if you went to private school, this way of teaching did not perhaps quite so much, for a variety of reasons, permeate public school literature teaching. But it was simply, as a result of understanding poetry, the way to go. It took time. If you had more than 50 minutes, you could actually make ample use of it. T.S. Eliot, who was in many ways associated with the new criticism, one of its intellectual forebears, nevertheless took a somewhat dim view of it and called it lemon squeezer criticism. But what this meant is, it takes time. You've got to squeeze absolutely everything out of it. And so it was ideal from the standpoint of teaching, and it was, it seems to me, also wonderfully galvanizing intellectually, because it really did make people think. Look how intricate what I thought was simple turns out to be. The new criticism, incontestably and without rival, created an atmosphere in which it was okay to notice that things were a little more difficult than they'd been supposed to be. And this in itself was extraordinarily useful and constructive, not just for subsequent literary theory, I think, but for the way in which English teaching actually can help people think better. All of this, the new criticism had a great deal to do with. And when I talk next time about the way in which it's been vilified for the last 40 or 50 years, naturally I will have this in the back of my mind. So in any case, where did this preoccupation with form, because we're beginning to think about the way in which theory can preoccupy, but not necessarily, but can preoccupy itself with form, where does it come from? Well, needless to say, I'm about to say it goes back to the beginning. When Plato writes his Republic and devotes Book 10, as I'm sure most of you know, to an argument, in effect, banishing the poets from the ideal republic, part of the argument is that poets are terrible imitators. They imitate reality as badly as they possibly can. They're 3 times removed from the ideal forms of objects in reality. They're a hopeless mess. They get everything wrong. They think that a stick refracted in the water is therefore a crooked stick. They're subject to every conceivable kind of illusion, not to be trusted, and Socrates calls them liars. Okay, now when Aristotle writes his Poetics, he does so, and this is true, and rewards scrutiny if one thinks carefully about the Poetics. He does so very consciously in refutation of Plato's arguments in the Republic. And one, perhaps the keystone of this refutation is simply this. Plato says poets imitate badly. Aristotle says this is a category mistake because poets don't imitate reality. Poets don't imitate, says Aristotle, things as they are. They imitate things as they should be. In other words, the business of poets is to organize, to bring form to bear on the messiness of reality. And in so doing, to construct not an alternate reality in the sense that it has nothing to do with the real world, that is to say, it doesn't mention the real world, or it somehow or another invents, human beings made out of chocolate or something like that, but idealizes the elements existing in the real world such that its object is something other than reality as such. And this is really the origin of formalism. Aristotle is considered the ancestor of the varying sorts of thought about form, and it's this move that he makes in the Poetics that engenders this possibility. Now, turning to your sheet. In the early modern period, the poet and courtier Sir Philip Sidney wrote an elegant, really wonderfully written defense of poetry in one edition called The Apology for Poesy. And in this edition, he develops, while actually a fervent admirer of Plato, he nevertheless develops this idea of Aristotle with remarkable rhetorical ingenuity, and I think very impressively lays out the case that Aristotle first makes. First passage on your sheet. Sidney's talking about the various kinds of discourse: divinity, hymnody, science, philosophy, history. In other words, all the ways in which you can contribute to human betterment, human welfare. And he says all but one of them, there is a serving science. That is to say, it is subservient to the natural world. Its importance is that it refers to that world. First sentence of your passage. There is no art but one, delivered to mankind, that hath not the works of nature for his principal object. This, by the way, although it's not exactly a work of nature, this, by the way, is why even that which is incontestably better than secular poetry, hymnody, and also divine knowledge, theology, that's why even these fields, which are the supreme fields, are also serving sciences. They are subservient to an idea that they have to express, which is the idea of God, right? And God is real. Nobody, I mean, we're sort of, there's no sense that we're making God up in this kind of discourse. Sidney is a devout, a devoutly religious person, and there is there's no semblance of doubt in his attitude. And yet he is saying something very special about the poet, who is somewhere in between divinity and the other sorts of discourse with which poetry is traditionally in rivalry: science, philosophy, and history. And he says this is what's unique about poetry. Only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any such subjection, in other words, to things as they are, disdaining to be tied to any such subjection, lifted up with the vigor of his own invention, doth grow in effect another nature. He nothing affirms, and therefore never lieth. In other words, Plato is wrong. The poet is not a liar because he's not talking about anything that's verifiable or falsifiable. He is simply talking about the parameters of the world he has brought into being. Sidney thinks of it as a kind of magic. He invokes, for example, the pseudoscience of alchemy. The poet, he says, ranges freely within the zodiac of his own wit. He also invokes the pseudoscience, I'm sorry, I meant to say astrology. He also invokes the pseudoscience of alchemy when he says that the poet inhabits a brazen world. And of this brazen world, he makes a golden world. In other words, poetry is transformational. In representing not things as they are, but things as they should be, it transforms reality. All right, so this is an argument which in outline, once again, justifies the idea of literature as form, as that which brings form to bear on the chaos and messiness of the real. Now, I don't mean to say things just stood as Sidney said they were until you get to Kant. A great deal happens. But an aspect of Kant's famous Copernican revolution in the history of philosophy is his ideas about aesthetics and the beautiful, and about the special faculty that he believes has to do with and mediates our aesthetic understanding of things, a faculty which he calls the judgment. So that in the Critique of Judgment, 1790, he outlines a philosophy of the beautiful and of the means whereby the judgment makes judgments of the beautiful. He does a great deal else in it, but I'm isolating this strand, which is what's relevant to what we're talking about. In many ways, Kant, without knowing anything about Sidney, nevertheless follows from Sidney, particularly in this, as you'll see. I'm going to look sort of with some care at these passages, so all will become clear, but particularly in this. Sidney, and I didn't exactly quote the passage in which Sidney does this, but I urged you to believe that he does. Sidney actually ranks poetry somewhere between divinity and the other sciences. In other words, poetry is not the supreme thing that a person can do. Sidney believed this so much, in fact, that when he knew himself to be dying, having been mortally wounded in a battle, he ordered that all of his own poems be burned. I mean, he had, you know, from the standpoint of a devout person, he had no doubt that poetry was inferior to divinity. Now, in a way, that's what Kant's saying too. In the passages you'll read, you'll see that the point is not that art and the judgment of the beautiful is the supreme thing that humanity can be engaged with. The point is only that it has a special characteristic that nothing else has. That's the point that this whole tradition is trying to make. So this is the way Kant puts it, turning first to the second passage. The pleasant and the good both have a reference to the faculty of desire. The pleasant is the way in which our appetency, our sensuous faculty, which Kant calls the understanding, by the way, understands things. Things are either pleasant or unpleasant. The good, on the contrary, is the way in which our cognitive and moral faculty, which Kant calls the reason, understands things. Things are either to be approved of or not to be approved of. But in each case, as Kant argues, they have a reference to the faculty of desire. I want, I don't want, I approve, I disapprove. And they bring with them the former, that is to say, the pleasant, a satisfaction pathologically conditioned. The latter, a pure practical, purposeful satisfaction which is determined not merely by the representation of the object, that is to say, by the fact that the represented object exists for me, right? Not merely by the representation of the object, but also by the represented connection of the subject with the existence of the object. In other words, by the way in which I want it or don't want it, approve of it or don't approve of it. My subjectivity, in other words, determines my attitude toward it. Whereas what Kant is saying is that my attitude of that which simply stands before us as what is neither pleasant nor good, but is rather something else, doesn't exist for me. It exists in and for itself. The next passage. Taste is the faculty of judging of an object.
Died for us. Romans 5:8. Christ paid the penalty. And so you go on to the fifth passage in this short series. And it's Ephesians 2:11.
Hello?
Salvation is a free gift of
Yes, hello?
the penalty that God.
Smart Classroom, man. Second floor, Brooklyn, all day.
Scripture says in Ephesians 2:8-9, for by grace it is free for nothing. Are you saved?
Second floor, Brooklyn, Hall Canyon, Smart Classroom.
Perhaps just to add to that, the fourth passage, beauty is the form of the purposiveness of an object so far as it is perceived in it without any representation of a purpose. Whoa, you say, well, listen. Kant makes a distinction between the purposive and the purposeful. What is the distinction? The purposeful is the purpose of the object in practical terms. What can it do? What can it do for me? How does it go to work in the world? What is its function among other objects? What bearing does it have on, in particular, my life? But the purposiveness of the object is the way in which it is sufficient unto itself. It has its own purpose, which is not a purpose that has any bearing necessarily on anything else. It has, in other words, an internal coherence. It has a dynamism of parts that is strictly with reference to its own existence. It is a form. It is a form, and that form, because we can see it has structure, because we can see it has organization and complexity, is purposive. That is to say, it manifests its self-sufficiency. So that's Kant's famous distinction between the purposive, which is the organization of an aesthetic object, and the purposeful, which is the organization of any object insofar as it goes to work in the world or for us. An aesthetic object can be purposeful. That is to say, we can view it as purposeful. I see a naked body, which the art historians call a nude. I don't accept that it's merely a nude. I want it, or I disapprove of it, and lo and behold, it's no longer aesthetic. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I hope you can see that that is a distinction between the purposive and the purposeful. Now, just in order to reprise these important distinctions, I want to turn to a passage in Samuel Coleridge, who is, at least on this occasion, a disciple of Kant, and is, I think, usefully paraphrasing the arguments of Kant that we've just been engaged in. Fifth passage on your sheet. The beautiful, says Coleridge, is at once distinguished both from the agreeable, which is beneath it, and notice the sort of stationing of the beautiful as Sidney stations it between what's beneath it and what's above it, from the agreeable which is beneath it and from the good which is above it. For both these necessarily have an interest attached to them. Both act on the will and excite a desire for the actual existence of the image or idea contemplated, while the sense of beauty rests gratified in the mere contemplation or intuition, regardless whether it be a fictitious Apollo or a real Antinous. In other words, the judgment of beauty does not depend on the existence of the object for its satisfaction. Now, Oscar Wilde, ever the wag, and a person who put more good literary theory in ways that didn't seem like literary theory at all, perhaps in the entire history of thinking about these subjects, says in the famous series of aphorisms which constitute his preface to the picture of Dorian Gray, he concludes this series of aphorisms by winking at us and saying, all art is quite useless. I hope that after reading these passages and enduring the explication of them that you've just heard, you can immediately see what Wilde means by saying all art is quite useless. He's appropriating a term of opprobrium, you know, in the utilitarian tradition. Oh, my goodness, that something would be useless, right? He's appropriating a term of opprobrium and pointing out that it is an extraordinarily unique thing about art, that it's useless. In other words, that it appeals to no merely appetitive or other form of subjective interest. We don't have to have an interest in it in the sense of owning part of a company. We don't have to have an interest in it in order to appreciate it. In other words, we can be objective about it. We can distance ourselves from our subjective wants and needs and likes and dislikes. And we can coexist with it in a happy and constructive way that is good for both of us. Because if we recognize that there are things in the world which have intrinsic value and importance and what we call beauty, and yet are not the things that we covet or wish to banish. We recognize in ourselves the capacity for disinterestedness. We recognize in ourselves a virtue which is considered to be the cornerstone of many systems of moral understanding. To realize that we're not interested in everything and merely for that reason take a view of things, but that there are things that we don't have to have that kind of interest in and can nevertheless recognize as self-sufficient and valuable, is important. The suggestion is, Wilde's suggestion, but I think also Kant's suggestion before him, is important for our recognition of our own value. And by the same token, all this harping on the autonomy of art, that is to say, the self-sufficiency of art, the way in which it's not dependent on anything, as Sidney says, the way in which it's not a serving science, existing merely to represent things other than itself, right? The way in which this is possible for art is also, as our own capacity to be disinterested is, a way of acknowledging that freedom exists, that I am free, that things are free. Things are free from my instrumental interest in them. So that, in general, what's implicit in this view of art and this view of human judgment, and what makes it so important in the history of thought, is that once again, and this is not the first time we've brought this up in these lectures and won't be the last, is that once again, it's a way of recognizing that in addition to all the other things that we are, some of them wonderful, in addition to all of that, we are also free. There is in us, at least, an element that is free, independent, serving nothing, autonomous. And this idea of our freedom, and by implication of the freedom of other things from our instrumental interests, is what sustains the formalist tradition, and against various kinds of criticism and objection that we'll be taking up in turn as the case arises, sustains and keeps bringing back into the history of thought on these subjects the notion that form, simply for its own sake, as the notorious aestheticist movement at the end of the 19th century put it, is valuable. All right, now, John Crowe Ransom, who was never at Yale, but is nevertheless one of the founders or first members of a self-identified school of figures who called themselves the New Critics, published a book called The New Criticism. And that's where the term, the New Critics, comes from. You may have noticed in your Wimsat essay that there's a footnote to somebody named Joel Spingarn, who wrote an essay called The New Criticism in 1924. Not to worry, that has nothing to do with the New Criticism. That just means criticism which is recent. Different matter altogether. By the same token, there is the work of Roland Barthes and some of his contemporaries, Poulet, whom I mentioned, Jean Starobinsky and others, was called in the French press La Nouvelle Critique, and that too, you know, then is an instance of the new criticism being used as a term, but that too has nothing to do with our subject. The New Critics, the American New Critics, as they're sometimes identified, were a school, and I use that advisedly because they're self-identified as a group, were a school of people who evolved this idea of the independent status Ransom calls it a discrete ontological object, the independent status of the work of art, and the means whereby it can be appreciated as independent in all of its complexity. And the first foray, our first foray into the thinking of this school will be our reading of Wimsatt and Beardsley's The Intentional Fallacy, which I'll get to in a minute. But simply as a reprise, take a look at the two passages from Ransom, which complete what's on your sheet, and which I think you can see create a link between the sort of thinking you've encountered in reading The Intentional Fallacy and the tradition that I've been trying to describe. Passage 7 ought to be completely transparent to you now, because it is simply a paraphrase of the passages I've given you from Kant and Coleridge. The experience, says Ransom, the experience called beauty is beyond the powerful ethical will precisely as it is beyond the animal passion. And indeed, these last two are competitive and coordinate. In other words, what they have in common with each other, ethical will and animal passion, is that they're both grounded in interest. Right? That's the point of, Sir Kenneth Clark's word, the nude. We have for the naked human being, as viewed both by the appetites and by moral reason, as a common term from the standpoint both of what Kant calls the understanding and from what Kant calls the reason. The expression naked body is just fine. But if we do believe there's another category, the aesthetic, viewed by an independent faculty called the judgment, we need another word. When we're looking, modern painters like Philip Pearlstein and Lucien Freud would strongly disagree, but in a way that's the point. When we're looking at a painting of a naked body, we don't say, oh, that's a naked body. We say that's a nude. And that distinction is what, as it were, bears out the implicit way, the semi-conscious way in which all of us acknowledge there to be a category that we call the aesthetic judgment. On the other hand, a lot of people think it's all hokum. And in fact, the predominant view in the 20th century has been that there's no such thing as disinterestedness, that whatever we're looking at, we have an interest in and form views of, and that this Kantian moment of dispassionate or disinterested contemplation is what the early 20th century critic I.A. Richards called a phantom aesthetic state. And so the predominant view is of this kind. But, just to do it justice in passing, there is a certain sense, is there not, in which we suddenly find ourselves, without meaning to and without being simply victims of sort of cultural tyranny, we suddenly find ourselves standing in front of something, clasping our hands, tilting our head, and feeling somehow or another different from the way we feel when we typically look at things. And that, too, is an intuitive way of saying, yeah, something like this, however rigorously we can define it or defend it, something like this does seem to go on in our minds at certain kinds of moments of experience. We just feel differently looking at a certain work of art than we feel, or a certain landscape, let's say, than we feel looking at other sorts of things. Maybe we don't know why. Maybe we doubt that the difference is absolute in the way that Kant wants to insist it is. But nevertheless, we have in tendency feelings of this kind, and we should acknowledge them because, again, at least in terms of its of a weak understanding of these positions, it does tend to justify them. At least it explains to us why people can have had such thoughts. Okay, Wimsatt. Wimsatt, right off, I keep saying Wimsatt, again it's Wimsatt and Beardsley, but I already explained, how that is. Wimsatt, right off the bat, attacks what he calls the romantic understanding of literature. Now, what does he mean by romantic? It's the attitude which supposes that a poem, and that's Wimsatt's privileged word, which I'll try to explain, that a poem is an expression, that is to say, is the expression of some passion or profound genius working its way into a form, but that the important thing is the expression. This much, by the way, Wimsatt has in common with Gadamer, because, you know, Gadamer doesn't talk much about authors either. And Gadamer is interested in what he calls meaning, the subject matter, die Sache. Right? He's not interested in your sort of expression of that meaning or my expression of that meaning. He's interested in the way in which a reader can come to terms with a meaning. And that much, as I say, despite the profoundly different nature of their projects, Wimsatt and Gadamer have in common. So a poem is not an expression, but an independent object with a self-contained meaning. And if this meaning is not self-evident to the attentive reader, then we don't judge the poem a success. This is where evaluation comes in. The success or failure of a poem depends on the realization of meaning. It doesn't depend on our going to the archive, finding out what the author said in his letters about it, finding out what he told his friends, what he told the newspapers. It doesn't involve any of that. If the meaning is not clear in the poem, we judge the poem a failure. We don't refer. We have no reason to refer if we respect the autonomy of the poem as such. We don't refer. We don't appeal to an authorial intention. Hence, on page 811, left-hand column, about a third of the way down, the design or intention of the author is neither available nor desirable as a standard for judging the success of a work of literary art. So that, and it follows from this that even a short poem, even a short lyric poem, and here you could see Wimsatt following Foucault. I mean, he's obviously not following, anticipating Foucault, and again, they have nothing to do with each other, but there is this overlap. Even a short poem doesn't really have an author. It has a speaker, a figure speaking in the poem that needs to be understood dramatically. That is to say, as though the poem were one of Browning's or T.S. Eliot's dramatic monologues. In other words, so that the speaker of any poem, on Wimsatt's view, is a speaker endowed with a certain character, a certain viewpoint, a certain argument to be put forward, and that in order and that our concern about the speaker has to be a concern within the poem of the way in which this character is elaborated, and not reinforced somehow by biographical reference to that which is not the speaker, but the author standing back there somewhere behind the poem. Now, why focus on the poem? Notice that we never hear about literature. We never even hear about poetry. The object of attention for an analysis of this kind is the poem. Well, the poem is, as John Donne puts it, a little world made cunningly. It's a microcosm. It is a distillation or quintessence. It is a model, in other words, for the way in which literature can be understood as world-making. Not a representation, again, of things as they are, but of things as they should be. Whereas they should be is not, whereby things as they should be is not necessarily an ideal, but rather that which is formal, that which is organized, that which has a coherence and makes sense self-sufficiently and within itself. That's why the lyric poem, is privileged among the forms of literary discourse in the new criticism. All literature is, by implication, a poem. But the poem is the privileged site of analysis whereby this broader statement can be made to seem reasonable. Hence the emphasis on the poem. The absence of the Romantic word poetry is therefore not insignificant. Poetry is that which just sort of spills out of me. It's my spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Never mind that, the new criticism isn't interested in spontaneous overflows of powerful feelings. Wimsatt has his little joke about drinking a pint of beer, taking a walk. You know, I mean, the new criticism just isn't interested in those sorts of spontaneous overflow. Sorry, I won't go there. But in any case, he goes on. He goes on to say, all right, if we're focused on the work of art in and of itself, on the poem, we obviously, in thinking about what it means, need to come to terms with three kinds of evidence. That is to say, some things have a bearing on what it means and some things don't. What does have a bearing is language. That is to say, words in the public domain which all of us share and which we can study in order to come to terms with the exact meaning of the poem. A certain word, and this is of course what kept you in your high school classes for so long, a certain word has 5 or 6 different meanings. The new criticism delights in showing how all 5 or 6 of those meanings do have some bearing on the meaning of the poem. That's all legitimate evidence. That is what one uses to build up the structure of the interpretation of the poem. What is not relevant is what I've mentioned already, what the author said about the poem in letters, to friends, to newspapers, and so on. That has no relevance. Then Wimsatt acknowledges that there's a sort of messy third category of evidence, which has to do with language and is therefore legitimate to a point, but also has to do with the author's idiosyncrasies. That is to say, the way that author in particular used language, certain coterie words, simply a private misunderstanding of certain words. You know, you got to know when you're reading Whitman what he means by camerado. You know, it's not exactly what the rest of us typically mean when we don't use that word exactly, but it's what we typically mean when we speak of comrades or comradeship. There is, in other words, the word is loaded in ways that Wimsatt would probably acknowledge need to be taken into account if we're going to understand what Whitman is up to. Now, this is very tricky, and he spends the rest of his essay talking about the murky boundaries between evidence, type of evidence 2, which is out of play, and type of evidence 3, which may be in play, but has to be dealt with in a gingerly and careful way. But I'm more interested, actually, in a footnote, which arises from this argument about the idiosyncratic nature of language as a particular author may use it. Because the footnote says, you know what, that's just one consideration we bring to bear on the function of language in a poem. This footnote, number 11, bottom of page 814 over to 815, is just about as devastating and counterintuitive a pronouncement as is made anywhere in our entire syllabus. I mean, you know, the new critics, what you would think you would find, the most earth-shattering pronouncement that anybody could ever possibly make in the new critics. Well, look at this footnote. And the history of words after a poem is written may contribute meanings, which, if relevant to the original pattern, should not be ruled out by a scruple about intention. That is bold. The great creator raised his plastic arm. Right? Everybody knows Akenside didn't mean polymers. But now we're all into cyberborgs, and we take all of this very seriously. And in a way, it's a tribute to the great creator, and also an acknowledgement of the fact that the great creator lives in the eternal moment. He's not subject to history. I mean, the great creator knew in the 18th century that someday plastic would mean polymer, right? And obviously that's one of the divine attributes. Therefore, if the great creator chooses to raise his prosthetic limb, that is simply a way of understanding what it is like to be everything omnipotent and omniscient in the eternal moment. In other words, if you take Wimsatt's 11th footnote seriously, that is a perfectly legitimate way not to ironically undermine Akenside's line, but actually to reinforce it and to give it a kind of formal richness which it does not otherwise have. I realize that I'm out of time, and so I'll begin the next lecture by talking about a poem of Yeats called Lapis Lazuli, written in 1935, in which he talks about the way in which people who build up things that have been destroyed are always gay. And of course, Nietzsche doesn't mean, we say, invoking intention. Nietzsche doesn't mean that they're always gay. He is using the English translation of the German word fröhlich from Nietzsche's The Gay Science. He is an astute and careful reader of Nietzsche, and in some ways elaborating on what Nietzsche says in that book in his poem Lapis Lazuli. But beginning of the next lecture, we will do the same thing with the word gay that we've just done with the word plastic, and then we will go ahead and we will consider the essay of Cleanth Brooks and other aspects of the new criticism.
Island Yorkville during a burglary. In that case, he was sentenced to life but paroled after 8 years. The Honduran president is calling for a full independent investigation into last night's prison fire that killed as many as 350 inmates. And the Archbishop reports relatives of the inmates have surrounded the prison and are demanding a list of survivors. On Honduran television, President Porfirio Lobo suspended the administrators not just at the Comayagua Penitentiary where the deadly blaze took place, but in all 24 prisons nationwide. President Lobo expressed condolences to the family members of prisoners who died and said his heart is with them. The fire broke out around 11 p.m. Tuesday night. Most of the dead were trapped in their cells. Survivors interviewed on local television said the flames spread quickly, causing panic among both inmates and guards. President Lobo says the number of bodies is so great that the Honduran Army will assist in transporting the corpses to family members across the country. Jason.
Last time, we were giving examples of what might happen if one takes seriously that extraordinary 11th footnote in Wimsatt's The Intentional Fallacy, in which he says, the history of words after a poem was composed may well be relevant to the overall structure of the poem and should not be avoided owing simply to a scruple about intention. Essentially, that's what Wimsatt says in the footnote. So I went back to the great creator raising his plastic arm and suggested that, well, maybe after all, there might be some good way of complicating the meaning of Akenside by suggesting that the modern anachronistic meaning of plastic would be relevant to the sense of the poem. This is, by the way, I mean, just because one can make this claim, and I think make it stick in certain cases, doesn't mean that the proposition is any less outrageous. I mean, just imagine a philologist being confronted with the idea that the meaning of words at a certain historical moment isn't the only thing that matters in understanding the meaning of a poem. So I just wanted to give another example, a little closer to home, of the poem of Yeats, 1935 poem Lapis Lazuli. I began talking about it. It's a poem which begins, I have heard that hysterical women say they are sick of the palette and fiddle bow, of poets that are always gay. Now, this is a poem that, the storm clouds of the approaching war are beginning to gather. A lot of people are saying enough of this kind of, effete culture. We need to think about important things, particularly about politics and the social order. By the way, a very powerful argument in 1935. But in any case, Yeats was on the other side of the controversy and insisted, after all, that there is a continuing role for art, as indeed, on the other hand, there may well be. And he said, so he's sick of everybody saying they don't want to talk about painting, they don't want to talk about music, and they don't want to talk about poets who are always gay. All right. So then the poem continues. It involves a stone, a piece of lapis lazuli that has a kind of a flaw in it, which is like a watercourse, and where one can imagine a pilgrim climbing toward increased enlightenment. And as the poem goes on, Yeats talks about the way in which civilizations crumble, that is to say, all things fall apart. But then it's possible to build them back up. And he says, all things fall and are built again, and those that build them again are gay. Now, as I said last time, needless to say, Yeats was not aware of the anachronistic meaning that we may be tempted to bring to bear on the poem. Yeats is thinking of Nietzsche. He's thinking of a word, fröhlich, which probably is best translated joyous, energetically joyous. And he is just borrowing that word from the translation of a book by Nietzsche. Well and good. But if you were a queer theorist, or if you were interested in making not a weak but a strong claim for the importance of queerness in our literary tradition, you would be very tempted to say this enriches the poem. Not just, in other words, that they are energetically joyous as creators, but also that in our contemporary sense of the word, they're gay. Now, this, again, as in the case of Akenside, may or may not raise the hackles of the philologist. But there's a certain sense in which, from a certain point of view, it's difficult to deny that it doesn't lend a certain coherence, additionally complex coherence, to the nature of the poem. All right, and then, we have Tony the Tow Truck. You're probably beginning to wish I would refer to it, so why don't I? In the second line of Tony the Tow Truck, we learn, I live in a little yellow garage. Now, of course, the denotation of the word yellow, as Cleanth Brooks would say, is that the garage is painted a certain color. The connotation, which undoubtedly the author had no notion of, wasn't thinking of, this is a book for toddlers, the connotation is that somehow or another there's the imputation of cowardice, possibly also the derogatory imputation of being Asian. Maybe Tony is Asian. Well, okay, well, this has nothing to do with the text, we say. And yet at the same time, suppose it did. I mean, we could interrogate the author psychoanalytically. We could say, hey, wait a minute, okay, so you say it was painted yellow. Why don't you say it's painted some other color? And we could begin to put a certain amount of pressure on the text and possibly, as I say, begin to do things with it, which are a kind of five-finger exercise, and we'll be doing a lot more of that sort of thing, but which might work. All right, these are examples of the extraordinary implications of Wimsatt's 11th footnote, and also, I think, perhaps in advance of today's discussion, clarify to some extent the importance for critics of this kind of the notion of unity. In some ways, everything we have to say today will concern the idea of unity. In other words, a connotation is valuable and ought to be invoked, even if it's philologically incorrect, if it contributes to the unity, the complex building up of the unity of the literary text. If, on the other hand, it is what Gadamer would call a bad prejudice, that is to say, some aspect of my subjectivity, that nothing could possibly be done with in thinking about, in interpreting the text, then you throw it out. So the criterion is it relevant to the unified form that we as critics are trying to realize in the text? And that criterion, as I say, not just for the sorts of semi-facetious readings we can do with Wimsatt's 11th footnote, but also for readings that may at least have some marginal plausibility, this sense of unity is what governs interpretive decisions of this kind. All right, now a word or two about the antecedents of the new criticism. In the first place, the 30s and 40s in the academic world bear witness to the rise of a canon of taste largely introduced by the great modernist writers, particularly by T.S. Eliot. You may notice that Brooks, for example, has a kind of done obsession. He gets that from Eliot's essay, The Metaphysical Poets, which is a review essay of a volume of Donne's poems edited by somebody named Grierson, which made Donne overnight, for a great many readers, the central poet in the English tradition. Brooks is still, as I say, very much under the influence of this. Well, Eliot, in The Metaphysical Poets, says some rather interesting things that had far-reaching consequences for the new criticism. He says, poetry in our own time, such is the complexity of the world we live in. Poetry must be difficult. He says, poetry has to reconcile all sorts of disparate experience. Reading Spinoza, the smell of cooking, the sound of the typewriter, all of this has to be yoked together in the imagery of a good poem, particularly of a metaphysical poem, and this model of complexity is what matters, both for modern literature and for literary criticism. Now, by the same token, other modernists like James Joyce are also contributing to this idea of the independent unity of the work of art. In Stephen Hero, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, you remember Stephen, in his disquisition on form and Aquinas and all the rest of it, argues that the work of art is something that is cut off from its creator because its creator withdraws from it and simply pares his fingernails, in the famous expression. It's very interesting. You remember that in the Wimsatt that you read last time, Wimsatt argues, I think probably thinking about that passage in Joyce, that the work of art is cut off from its author at birth. This is an umbilical cord he's talking about. It has no more connection with its author from birth on and roams the world on its own. And so ideas like this, as I say, are taken from the aesthetic and practical thinking about the nature of the work of art that one finds in modernism. In the meantime, the academic setting. In the 1930s, when Ransom in particular is writing his polemical manifestos, The New Criticism and the World's Body, and attacking most of what's going on as it's being done by his colleagues, he has two things in particular in mind. In the first place, old-fashioned philology, the kind of thinking about the literary text that would insist that plastic means what it means in the 18th century. And a lot of that was being done. This is the golden age of the consolidation of the literary profession. Editions are being created. The great learned journals are in their early phase. Knowledge is actually still being accumulated about having to do with the basic facts of the literary tradition. That we didn't know a great deal about certain authors until this period of flourishing of philology in the very late 19th and early 20th century took hold and pretty much created for us the archive that we now use today in a variety of ways. So although the new critics were fed up with philological criticism, I don't mean to be condescending toward it or to suggest that it didn't play a crucially important role in the evolution of literary studies. Now, the other thing that was going on, and here, I don't know, depending on one's viewpoint, perhaps some measure of condescension might be in order, but these two were spectacular figures. The other thing that was going on was there was a vogue for what might be called appreciative teaching. That is, I mean, the contemporary and colleague of I.A. Richards at Cambridge was the famous Q, Sir Arthur Quiller Couch, whose mesmerizing lectures had virtually no content at all. They were simply evocations, appreciative evocations of great works of literature. And I have to say that at Yale, exactly contemporary with Q, we had a similar figure. The person after whom Phelps Gate is named, the great William Lyon Phelps, who would enter the classroom, begin rapturously to quote Tennyson, would clasp his hands and say that it was really good stuff, and the students were the students were so appreciative that they gave hundreds and thousands of dollars to the university ever after. In other words, this is valuable teaching, but again, you know, but again, the new critics were fed up with it. This was the atmosphere they found themselves in, and what they wanted, and this anticipates the atmosphere that you'll see the Russian formalists found themselves in when we turn to them next week. What they wanted was something like rigor or a scientific basis or some sort of set of principles that could actually be invoked so that the business of criticism could become more careful and systematic, less scattershot, less effusive, and so on. So this is in effect the backdrop in which in the American Academy, but influenced, as we'll now see, by certain trends in the British Academy, arose in the 30s and in the 40s. All right, now the first figure I want to talk a little bit about, and the first figure whom you read for today's assignment, is I.A. Richards. Richards, before he joined the English department at Cambridge, was actually a psychologist and trained as a Pavlovian psychologist, so that when you read in his essay about stimuli and needs, you see pretty much where you stand. It is, I mean, his sense of the way in which the mind reacts to the world, to its experience, the way in which it's an uncomplicated reaction or a resisting reaction or an adjusting reaction, all has very much to do with Pavlovian principles. And these governed, to some extent, Richards's understanding of even of his literary vocation during the period when he wrote, 1924, when he wrote Principles of Literary Criticism. For Richards, reading is all about experience. That is to say, the way in which the mind is affected by what it reads. And so even though his subject matter is literature, he's nevertheless constantly talking about human psychology. That is to say, what need is answered by literature, how the psyche responds to literature, what's good and bad about psychic responses, and so on. This is the intellectual focus, in other words, of Richards's work. Now, another aspect of his having been and continuing to be a scientist is that Richards really did believe, seriously believed, in reference. That is to say, in the way in which language really can hook onto the world. Verifiable and falsifiable statement is for Richards the essence of scientific practice, and he cares very much about that. That is, it's not, I mean, he does not, in other words, share with so many literary critics, perhaps even with Brooks, who follows him in making the fundamental distinction I'm about to describe. He does not share with the majority of literary critics and artists a kind of distaste for science. I mean, and this, by the way, is also true of his student Empson, who was a math major before he became an English major. Both of them take very seriously the notion that there can be a scientific basis for what one does in English or in literary studies. So another aspect of it for Richards is, because he takes science so seriously, is that he actually reverses the idea that we talked about last time in Sidney and Kant and Coleridge and Wilde and Wimsatt. He actually reverses the idea that it's art that's autonomous. If you look on page 766 in the left-hand column, you'll find him saying that science is autonomous. And what he means by that is that scientific facts can be described in statements without the need for any kind of psychological context or any dependency on the varieties of human need. It is autonomous in the sense that it is a pure, uncluttered, and uninfluenced declaration of fact or falsehood. Then he says, to declare science autonomous is very different from subordinating all our activities to it, and here's where poetry comes in. It is merely to assert that so far as any body of references is undistorted, it belongs to science. It is not in the least to assert that no references may be distorted if advantage can thereby be gained. And just as there are innumerable human activities which require undistorted references, scientific activities, if they are to be satisfied, so there are innumerable other human activities not less important which equally require distorted references or, more plainly, fictions. Here you see Richards' basic distinction between what he calls scientific statement and what he calls emotive statement. The distinction between that which is truly referential, that which is incontrovertibly verifiable or falsifiable on the one hand, and that which is emotive. Later on, Richards changes his vocabulary, and he no longer talks about scientific and emotive language. He talks instead, even more dangerously from the standpoint of anybody who likes poetry, he talks instead of statement, meaning science, and pseudo-statement, meaning poetry. I mean, you're really out on a limb if you're going to defend poetry, as Richards kept doing, as pseudo-statement. But of course, pseudo-statement is just another expression for what he calls here fiction. Now, why on earth, once we sort of settle into this vocabulary and once we get used to this clearly, unquestioningly scientific perspective, why on earth do you need pseudo-statement or fiction at all? We know very well, by the way, that there are scientists who simply cannot stand to read poetry because it's false. Right? You know, it's, I mean, it just as Richard says, you know, poetry, there's always something kind of archaic or atavistic about poetic thinking. It's not just that it's not trying to tell the truth, as Sidney said, it nothing lieth because it never affirmeth. Not just that it's not trying to tell the truth, it is in fact, Richards goes so far as to say, following Plato, it is in fact lying. Poetry is constantly getting itself in trouble in all sorts of ways. I mean, on page 768, for example, I know it's 768, although I can't find my reference in the lecture. See if I can find it in the book. It is evident, he says, at the top, sort of toward the top of the right-hand column, 768, it is evident that the bulk of poetry consists of statements which only the very foolish would think of attempting to verify. They are not the kinds of things which can be verified. Pack of lies. You know, I mean, and then we say, you know, it usually follows from this that somebody like this points out that whereas we all know that democratic society is the best society to live in, poetry prefers feudal society. It makes better poetry. And whereas we all know that the universe is of a certain kind, we can't even call it Copernican anymore. Poetry has this odd preference for Ptolemaic astronomy. And in other words, everything about poetry is atavistic. It's a throwback to some earlier way of thinking. There's some kind of latent primitivism in poetic thinking. And Richard seems cheerfully to embrace this idea. That's what he means by fiction or pseudo-statement. So why on earth do we want it? We want it, according to Richards, because it answers needs in our psychological makeup that science can't answer. In other words, we are, you know, a chaos of desires. Some of them involve the desire for truth, that is to say, for what we can learn from science. But a great many of our desires have nothing to do with any notion of truth, but rather are needs that require fanciful or imaginative fulfillment, fulfillment of other kinds. And the reason this fulfillment is important and can be valued is, according to Richards, that these needs, unless they are organized, harmonized, so that they work together in what he sometimes calls a synthesis, can actually tear us apart. Literature is what can reconcile conflicting or opposing needs. And Richards cares so much about this basic idea that in another text, not in the text you've just read, he says, shockingly, poetry is capable of saving us. In other words, poetry is capable of doing now what religion used to do. Poetry, and remember, this is a scientist, poetry is no more true than religion, but it can perform the function of religion and is therefore capable of saving us. And so, even despite the seeming derogation of the very thing that he purports to be celebrating in books like The Principles of Literary Criticism, Richards does hold out an extraordinarily important feeling for the mission of poetry, to harmonize conflicting needs. That's the role of poetry, and that's what it does simply by evoking our wishes, our desires, irrespective of truth, in their complicated, chaotic form and synthesizing them organically into something that amounts to psychological peace, something that leaves us. It's a little bit like Aristotle's idea of catharsis, which can be understood in a variety of ways, but Milton at the end of Samson Agonistes understands it in one way when he says, now we have, as a result of this tragedy, calm of mind, all passion spent. That could be the motto to Richards's work. The experience of art, the experience of poetry, the reconciliation of conflicting needs results in a kind of catharsis, calm of mind, all passion spent. All right, now Richards had a student, an undergraduate student, William Empson, who had, as I say, been a math major, who decided he'd switch to English. He went to Richards and he said he had an idea about ambiguity. He said he thought there was quite a bit that could be written about it, and so he wondered if Richards would mind if maybe he worked on that. Richards said, fine, sounds terrific, go do it. So a few months later, Empson brought him the manuscript of one of the greatest books of criticism in the 20th century and one of the most amazingly surprising, 7 Types of Ambiguity. The brief excerpt you have in your packet, I trust that you have picked it up by this time at Tycho, your photocopy packet. The brief excerpt you have from Empson is taken from 7 Types of Ambiguity. I think Empson is the funniest person who has ever written literary criticism. I think that his deadpan way of bringing things down to earth when they get a little too highfalutin involves the skill of a genuine stand-up comic. His timing is perfect. He has, in other words, all the attributes of a great comic writer. I enjoyed reading him so much that when I was asked to write a book about him, I agreed to do so. I've always been like that. I enjoyed that. Byron was the only person I enjoyed reading during the nail-biting, intense period of studying for my orals. So I wrote my dissertation on Byron as a result of that. Nothing complicated, no deep reason for doing these things. But Empson, I hope you enjoy. He's a page-turner. And his extraordinary brilliance as a critic is really just part of the experience of reading him. I'm particularly interested in the excerpt you have in what he does with his notion of, because this is his way of responding to enthusiastic or appreciative criticism. One of the tricks of Q and Billy Phelps and all the other sort of authors and lecturers in this mode was to say that they read for atmosphere, that there was something that one just felt along one's bloodstream or in the pulses when one encountered great literature. And their purpose as lecturers and as critics was to evoke the atmosphere of things. And so Emerson says, well, you know, atmosphere, certainly that exists, and we can talk about it in all sorts of ways. But after all, what is the use of atmosphere? What is the use of any aspect of literature if, as good scientists, we can't analyze it? If we can't somehow or another account for it? If there is atmosphere in the passage I'm about to quote from Macbeth, it must be atmosphere of a certain kind and there for a certain reason. And what follows, it seems to me, is one of the most staggeringly beautiful, wonderful, amazing riffs on a passage of literature that you can encounter. I'm sorry if I sound a little bit like Billy Phelps, but I do get excited. He quotes the passage from Macbeth. As Emerson says, you know, the murderers have just left the room, and Macbeth is sort of twiddling his thumbs, hoping it's getting dark because it's got to get dark before Banquo can be killed. So naturally, he looks out the window to see to see how the time is going, and this is what he says: "Come, sealing night, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day, that with thy bloody and invisible hand cancel and tear to pieces that great bond that keeps us pale." Emerson doesn't mention this word pale, but in juxtaposition with the crows and rooks, it strikes me that it itself is an interesting moment in the passage. Light thickens, and the crow makes wing to the rooky wood. Emerson italicizes that because while he has something to say about every part of the passage, which all good criticism, by the way, should do. You quote something, say something about all of it. Okay, but Emerson italicizes these particular lines because it's going to be the true focus of what he'll say later. Good things of day begin to droop and drowse, while night's black agents to their praise do rouse. Thou marvelst at my words, but hold these. Lady Macbeth has come into the room, you know. So, thou marvelst at my words, but hold thee still. Things bad begun make strong themselves by ill. So prithee go with me. All right, so Emerson is fascinated by this passage, and then he gives you in the next few paragraphs the amazing variety of grounds for his fascination. And he says, look, this is what people mean when they talk about atmosphere. It's not just something you feel on your pulse, it's something that can be described, something that can be analyzed. And I just want to touch on the last part of it. He says, rooks live in a crowd and are mainly vegetarian. Emerson's the person who says that the ancient mariner shot the albatross because the crew was hungry. He points out that in the 1798 edition of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, biscuit worms had gotten into the hardtack. So naturally, he says, the particular kind of albatross that the mariner shot, I am told, makes a very tolerable broth. This is this is the mode of William Emerson. And so he begins here, rooks live in a crowd and are mainly vegetarian. Crow may be either another name for rook, especially when seen alone, or it may mean the solitary carrion crow. This subdued pun, this ambiguity, remember this is a book about ambiguity, this subdued pun is made to imply here that Macbeth, looking out of the window, is trying to see himself as a murderer and can only see himself as in the position of the crow, that his day of power now is closing, that he has to distinguish himself from the other rooks by a difference of name, rook-crow, like the kingly title only, that he is anxious at bottom to be one with the other rooks, not to murder them, that he can no longer, or that he may yet be united with the rookery, and that he is murdering Banquo in a forlorn attempt to obtain peace of mind. Well, I'm not at all sure there's anything more to be said about that passage, which I think lays it to rest. And it does so by insisting on a complex mode of ambiguity that governs the passage. Not atmosphere, sure, call it atmosphere if you like, as long as you're willing to subject it to verbal analysis, as long as you're willing to show how and why the atmosphere is exactly of the nature that it is, that it arises, in other words, and here is the relationship between Richards and Empson, that it arises out of a complex state of mind, that poetry, the poetry of this speaker/murderer, that poetry is attempting desperately to reconcile, to harmonize, just as he is attempting desperately to be reconciled and harmonized with the society from which he has alienated himself, and of course failing. Macbeth is not Shakespeare. Shakespeare is representing poetry attempting to do something which in the immediate psychological circumstances it can't do, but in the process evoking an extraordinary complexity of effort on the part of the mind to be reconciled through the medium of language. As I say, this is the sense in which Empson follows Richards. But at the same time, there's something rather different between, first of all, Empson doesn't really kind of settle into a sense that it's all about the reader. That is to say, it's all about the reader's experience of the literary. Richards is actually an avatar of figures like Iser, like Hans Robert Jauss and Stanley Fish, whom we'll be discussing later in the syllabus, who are interested in reader response. That is to say, in the way in which we can talk about the structure of reader experience. Empson is sort of interested in that, and just as he's fascinated by the texture of textual evidence itself, and he is also very interested, much more so than Richards, and certainly more so than the new critics from whom he sharply diverges in advance in this respect. He's also much more interested in authorial intention. That is to say, for him, literary criticism is always an appeal to authorial attention. Mind you, he ascribes to authorial attention the most amazingly outrageous things that other critics threw up their hands in despair about, but nevertheless, it is for him always still an appeal to authorial attention. At bottom, Empson doesn't really settle into the rigorous consideration of the author or of the text or of the reader as it were separate functions. For Empson, there's a kind of a fluid and easy movement back and forth between what for hermeneutics are three very different phenomena: author, text, reader. For Empson, it's a kind of synthetic mélange that's ultimately an appeal to the author, but certainly involves both the working on the text itself and also understanding its effects on the reader. So all of this distances Empson from Richards to a certain extent, but the most important difference, I think, between Empson and the other figures we're discussing, a difference which makes it even a little bit complex to say that he's a precursor of the new criticism, is that Empson very rarely concerns himself with the whole of a text. He isn't really interested in the unity of the poem. He's simply interested in saying as much as he can about certain local effects, certainly with the implication possibly that this has a bearing on our understanding of, let's say, the whole of Macbeth, but he doesn't set about doing a systematic reading of the whole of Macbeth. He always zooms in on something, thinks about it for a while, and then goes away and thinks about something else, leaving us to decide whether it has a genuine bearing on the entirety or on the literary wholeness or unity of Macbeth. Empson is interested in the complexity of local effects. And another thing to say about Empson's perspective, which makes him differ sharply, I think, from Richards and from the later new critics, is that Empson is perfectly willing to accommodate the idea that maybe, just as in the case of the psychology of Macbeth the character, that maybe poetry doesn't reconcile conflicting needs. Maybe, after all, poetry is an expression of the irreducible conflict of our needs. The last chapter of 7 Types of Ambiguity, his 7th ambiguity, is actually, as Empson said, about some fundamental division in the writer's mind. There, you see, he diverges from his teacher, Richards. He's fascinated by the way in which literature doesn't unify opposites or reconcile needs, but leaves things as it found them, but exposed in all of their complexity. Paul de Man more than once invoked Empson as a precursor of deconstruction, not of the new criticism. And for this reason, for the reason that he's not concerned with unity and that he's not concerned with the idea of the reconciliation of opposites, Empson, I think, can rightly be understood as a precursor of deconstruction, because deconstruction follows the new criticism, of course, in being a mode of close reading, and there has never been a better close reader than Empson. But it needs to be said, before turning away from Empson, whose influence was widespread despite this divergence, it needs to be said that his purposes for close reading are actually very different from the purposes of the new critics, the American new critics, particularly Brooks, whose preoccupation with unity is something he freely confesses, and something that, we've got 10 minutes, so I'm not going to, I shouldn't rush ahead prematurely, something that you can see to be at the heart of what Brooks is doing. Now, here Brooks in The Well-Wrought Urn and Modern Poetry in the Tradition and the other books for which he's well known, uses a variety of different words to describe the way in which the complexity of literature is placed in the service of unification. In the essay you're reading here, he uses the word irony. He admits that maybe he stretches the word irony, but he tries to argue that the variety of effects that he focuses on in his essay have to do with irony. In another great essay, the first chapter of The Well-Wrought Urn, he talks about paradox. Obviously, these are related ideas. And elsewhere, he takes up other ways of evoking the way in which sort of complex feelings and thoughts are brought together. Empson's word ambiguity continues to play an important role in the work of the new criticism, and it is, at least it puts itself forward as a candidate to be an alternative term that one might use if one got tired of saying irony or paradox. There are a variety of words, in other words. Another word given by the poet-critic Alan Tate, one of the founding figures of the new criticism, is tension. That is to say, the way in which the literary text resolves oppositions as a tension, that is, a holding in suspension of conflict, experienced as tension. So there are these varieties of ways for describing what's going on in a text. It's interesting, I think, that if one thinks of Tony the Tow Truck, one can think of when you go home and study it, you'll see what I mean. There's a complex pattern of imagery, as it were, between pulling and pushing. There's a tremendous amount of pulling and pushing that goes on in Tony the Tow Truck. We'll revert especially to the notion of pushing in other contexts later in the course. But for the moment, you can see the way in which there is a tension between that which pulls and that which pushes, which is one of the motive forces of the story. And that, I think, is an example also, if it is ironic that Tony is now stuck and instead of pulling needs to be pushed, if it is in some Brooksian sense ironic that that is the case, we can understand that as irony or as tension or ambiguity. So in any case, and now there's one way in which Tony is probably not a good proof text for the new criticism. You remember that in My Credo, the little sort of excerpt that you get at the beginning of the Brooks section in your anthology, Brooks says poetry should be about moral things, but it shouldn't point a moral. That is, and obviously, Tony the Tow Truck points a moral. And so would be subject to a kind of devaluation on those grounds by the new criticism, even though there are ways of reading Tony, as I've been suggesting, new critically. All right, now, the ideal of unity for Brooks, for the new critics in general, is that it be complex, that it warp the statements of science, that it bring to bear a tension between the denotation and the connotation of words. The word yellow in the second line of Tony the Tow Truck, its denotation is that it is a certain color, the color that Tony's garage is painted. The connotation, I've suggested, is of the variety of kinds that one might gingerly approach in thinking about complicating the texture of the story. In any case, the tension between denotation and connotation is part of the way in which irony works. So the question again is, and the question it seems to me raised in advance by Empson, is why should these sorts of tension, these movements of complex reconciliation, result in unity? It's very interesting. Brooks's reading of She Dwelt Among Uncommon Ways, the wonderful Lucy poem by Wordsworth, emphasizes the irony of the poem. Brooks feels that he's on very thin ice talking about Wordsworthian irony at all, but at the same time, does bring it out rather beautifully, talking about the irony of the poem basically as the way in which you can't really say that Lucy can be a flower and a star simultaneously. She's a flower, she's perishable, she's half hidden, she's ultimately dead and in the ground, whereas a star would seem to be something that she just can't be mapped onto if she is this half-hidden thing. But at the same time, Brooks says, well, after all, she is a star to the speaker. And he's just saying she's a star to me, she's a flower, half-hidden, unnoticed to everyone else. And the relationship between the depth of the speaker's feeling and the obscurity of Lucy in the world is the irony that the speaker wants to lay hold of, and that reconciles what seem like disparate facts in the poem. Well, now, I just want to point out that close reading can always be pushed farther. That's the difficulty about close reading. It's all very well to say, look at me, I'm reconciling harmonies, I'm creating patterns, I'm showing the purpose of image clusters and all the rest of it. But if you keep doing it, what you have yoked together becomes unyoked again. It falls apart, or at least it threatens to do so. A contemporary of Brooks's named F.W. Bateson wrote an essay on this same poem, She Dwelt Among Untrodden Ways, in which he points out, the poem's on page 802, in which he points out that the poem is full of oxymorons, contradictions in terms, untrodden ways. A way is a path, but how can there be a path if it's not trodden? What is the meaning of an untrodden way? There are none to praise her, but very few to love. Why call attention? Not so much to the difference between few love her and none praise her, as the notion that none praise her. This is palpably false because here's the poet praising her, right? So what does he mean? None. Why is he calling attention, in other words, to this logical disparity? She lived unknown, and few could know. How can she be unknown if few know anything about her? In other words, the poem is full of, not of complexities, but who says they're being reconciled? They're just sitting there oxymoronically, not reconciling themselves at all. So Bateson's argument is that Wordsworth is calling attention to a conflict of emotion or feeling that can't be reconciled. Hence the pathos of the ending, oh, the difference to me, and so on. And this, as I say, is a different use of close reading. It's close reading which is not in the service of unity or of unification, but recognizes that the very arts whereby we see a thing as a unified whole can just as easily be put to the purpose of blasting it apart again, and of calling our attention to that which can't be reconciled, just as the speaker can't be reconciled to the death of Lucy. Now, the new critics can, I think, be criticized for that reason, and the aftermath of the historical close reading aftermath of the new criticism does precisely that. If one sees deconstruction as a response to the new criticism, and it's not just that, as we'll see, it's a great many other things too, that response consists essentially in saying, look, you can't just arbitrarily tie a ribbon around something and say, aha, it's a unity, right? The ribbon comes off, woof, things fly apart, as the poet says, and it's not a unity after all. There is another aspect of the way in which the new criticism has been criticized for the last 40 or 50 years, which needs to be touched on. The notion of autonomy, the notion of the freedom of the poem from any kind of dependence in the world, is something that is very easy to undermine critically. Think of Brooks's analysis of Randall Jarrell's 8th Air Force. It concludes on the last page of the essay by saying, this is a poem about human nature under stress, whether or not human nature is or is not good. And arguments of this kind, arguments of the kind set forth by the poem, can make better citizens of us. In other words, the experience of reading poetry is not just an aesthetic experience. It's not just a question of private reconciliation of conflicting needs. It's a social experience on this view. And the social experience is intrinsically a conservative one. In other words, it insists on the need to balance opinions, to balance viewpoints, to balance needs precisely in a way which is, of course, implicitly a kind of social and political centrism. In other words, how can poetry on this view, how can literature be progressive? For that matter, how can it be reactionary? How, in other words, can it be put to political purposes if there's this underlying, this implicit centrism in this notion of reconciliation, harmonization, balance? And that has been a frequent source of the criticism, of the new criticism, in its aftermath over the last 40 or 50 years. There's also the question of religion. There's a kind of implicit Episcopalian perspective that you see in Brooks's essay when he's talking about the Shakespeare poem, in which under the aspect of eternity, inevitably, things here on earth seem ironic. and there is always, there's that play of thought throughout the thinking of the new criticism as well. Naturally, one will think of things in ironic terms if one sees them from the perspective of the divine or of the eternal moment.
De joven como en mi caso, que entonces las personas saben que ya yo tengo el llamado, ya yo tengo el ministerio, si no te alinea eso por mí, ¿verdad? Y con muchas cosas, pero aún así, tenemos que hoy levantar el sacerdocio y respetar al hombre y honrarlo. En casa de extensión, un equipo de pastores donde yo los honro. Así que somos muy bien, que en mi casa de restauración yo bendigo a los hombres de la casa. He tenido la bendición de que yo tengo hombres que aman a Dios, que están bien dirigidos, que están bien enfocados, que quieren seguir hacia adelante, y yo pues me siento honrada por eso. Entonces nosotros tenemos que saber que tenemos que ser mujer, y no te sientas mal. Yo quiero hoy hablarle a la mujer y ser un instrumento poderoso por la mujer. Conozco muchas mujeres que han sido afectadas por la palabra que Dios ha puesto en mis labios, y me honra, y yo quiero que tú seas una mujer poderosa y venimos agresivamente a favor del matrimonio, de la familia, y a decirle al divorcio: tú te vas, tú no te levantas más divorcio, tú no te levantas más espíritu de infidelidad, tú no te levantas más espíritu de control, más bien tenía un espíritu de Isabel, controladora, manipuladora. Oye, qué agresivo.
All right. So today we start a sequence which takes us through deconstruction, and it's a sequence which has genuine coherence. That is to say, these are figures, all of whom are attentive to each other's thought, draw on each other, and build from the materials that we're going to start covering toward a certain, not end, but toward a moment in which the materials seem to be undermined, actually, in deconstruction, but in which they are still prominent and set the terms of debate. The relationship between the Russian formalists and the work of the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, which we'll be taking up on Thursday, is a complex one. I'm going to say certain things about it, and you may find yourselves discussing this relationship in section. But I think much will come clear when we actually get into what's called structuralism, and you read the essay by Roman Jakobson called Linguistics and Poetics, Jakobson having spent the early part of his career as a card-carrying member of Opozhaz, the Russian formalists, and then who, owing to various forces that I'll be talking about, emigrated first to Prague, Czechoslovakia, where he joined a linguistic circle which in a variety of ways proved to be the origin of what's called structuralism. And then, of course, he moved on to Paris, where he knew Claude Lévi-Strauss and influenced him, and ultimately to the United States. But the essay, Linguistics and Poetics, which you'll be reading next week, I think will give you perhaps a clearer sense of the way in which the Russian formalist work and the work of Saussure, the foundational work of Saussure in the general course in linguistics, amalgamates in ways that are profoundly fruitful and influential for the subsequent course of structuralist and deconstructionist thinking. So today we begin thinking about the Russian formalists, but I also do want to think them as kicking off a tradition which, just in order to place them vis-a-vis what you've been reading and hearing about already, one can say something like this about this tradition. It differs markedly from, it's opposed to, hermeneutics in this one particular. And it's one that is maybe initially counterintuitive, but actually I think is rather important once you begin to think about it. Hermeneutics is, well, more or less, by nature, by definition, interested in meaning. That is to say, the arts of interpretation are used for the purpose of discovering, uncovering, arriving at meaning. And very frequently, as is the case in Gadamer, this meaning is called the subject matter. That is to say, what, in thinking about literature in terms of form and content, let's say, we'd call content. So in any case, hermeneutics is devoted to the discovery of meaning. And its basic, and the art that it's concerned with, is the art of interpretation. Well, the Russian formalists differ very sharply in this regard, because what they're interested in is precisely the way in which literariness, as they call it, the devices of literariness, can be deployed so as to impede, to interfere with, to hinder our arrival at meaning. If, in other words, hermeneutics is devoted to the possibility of communication, of understanding, the Russian formalists are interested in that special aspect of verbal communication called literariness, which actually interferes with these very processes of communication and understanding. The roughening of the surface, celebrated by Shklovsky as a form of defamiliarization. The roughening of the surface is what slows us down, what gets in the way of our arriving at meaning, and does so for a variety of reasons that the formalists are engaged to attend to. Now, you may take note of the fact that what I'm saying isn't completely convincing, perhaps, to those who have been reading the New Critics and Wolfgang Iser and have noticed that they, too, are very interested in the ways in which literariness does involve special techniques and devices that slow us down. In other words, replacing the shortest distance between 2 points that we experience in a practical message, literariness, as the formalists call it, poetic language, as they also sometimes call it, and as the New Critics certainly call it, slows us down. It creates, as a distance between 2 points, rather than a straight line, an arabesque. In other words, it makes us pause over what we're reading. It gets in the way of arriving too quickly at meaning, if indeed one arrives at meaning at all. The formalists are concerned about, however, about the way in which literature is put together. Those titles that Eichenbaum keeps talking about, how Don Quixote was made, how Gogol's overcoat was made, reflect the preoccupation of the Russian formalists with how literature is put together. In other words, whereas the New Critics and Wolfgang Iser are interested in the roughening of form, they're interested in it for hermeneutic purposes. It slows us down, yet, but this slowing down is a means of enriching what we finally grasp to be the meaning of a text. So they are still engaged in the hermeneutic enterprise, in interpretation. The formalists are really relatively indifferent to questions of meaning, to questions of interpretation. They're interested in the interest of what they call science. They're interested in structure. They're interested, in other words, in the way a text is put together. And that is, I think, essentially the difference between what we've been talking about so far, even though it has had a variety of outlooks, and what we are talking about now. Temporarily, as we advance through the syllabus, we're bracketing or suspending our interest in meaning and focusing instead on how something is made. Take, for example, Tony the Tow Truck. I mentioned, well, I can't remember when I mentioned it. It could have been in the audio you'll be hearing. I mentioned that an interesting phenomenon in Tony, the text of Tony, is the tripartition of the t sound. Tony tow truck. And just after we read in the text, Tony the tow truck, we encounter a triadic or triple encounter with vehicles. Neato, speedy, bumpy. In other words, there's a threeness which appears at a variety of levels in the text of Tony the Tow Truck, which exactly corresponds to the aphorism of Osip Brick, quoted by Eichenbaum in your text: repetition in verse is analogous to tautology in folklore. Now, we have uncovered something about the form, the structure of Tony the Tow Truck in saying this. But we haven't discovered or uncovered a thing about the meaning of Tony the Tow Truck. Nothing follows from this really, I think, rather interesting observation that there's a kind of pervasiveness of triadicity. Nothing follows from this observation about the actual meaning of the text. Now, if you're clever enough, maybe you could parlay it into a sense of the meaning of the text. Who knows? Maybe we'll try on some other occasion. But for the moment, I think you can see that in making remarks of this kind about a text, one has shifted the attention from meaning to structure. And it's in that context that most of the observations we encounter in Russian formalism need to be understood. Now, the stress on taxonomy, in other words, the stress on the relationship among parts, the understanding of the various parts of the literary texts as devices, that is to say, interrelated one with the others. This emphasis on taxonomy is one of the ways in which the formalists insist that what they're doing is scientific. Nobody can possibly miss, in reading Eichenbaum's rhetorically rather bizarre essay, his obsession with struggle, with the fight, with doing battle. I mean, you go on and you say to yourself, good heavens, it's just talk about literature, relax. It can't be that important, But but for Eichenbaum, there's obviously a lot at stake, and I'll try to give you some social and historical reasons why this is the case. But in the meantime, what he's struggling for is important to recognize too. In the very first sentence of the essay, you read the expression, the struggle for science. An interesting formulation, the struggle for science. Now, obviously, the struggle takes place against the backdrop of completely undisciplined and unsystematic thinking, which Eichenbaum identifies as the typical thinking of the universities, of the academy. I mean, it's a pretty state of affairs in his view when the most rigorous thinking that's being done about literature is being done in popular journals. And so that's part of the struggle, undoubtedly. But another part of the struggle is simply to reach some means, to break through to some means of understanding the thing that you're talking about. You want to talk about it systematically, but how can you talk about anything systematically if you don't know what it is? You need to pin down an object of study, a first principle from which other principles can emerge. And part of the process is to say, hey, it's not literature we're talking about. Who knows what literature is? Nobody's really ever known what literature is. What we're talking about is literariness. That is to say, certain devices that we can identify that perform a certain function. And maybe out of the identification of these devices to evolve a theory that's more widespread. Now, I use the word evolve deliberately. In the backdrop, in the background of that expression, struggle for science, there are two key figures. The first is obviously Marx, against the backdrop of the first great socialist revolution, which eventually resulted in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, when the Russian formalist movement was at its height, against the backdrop of Marxist thought pervading not just Russian life, but beginning to pervade Russian government. Against this backdrop, the idea of struggle, as in class struggle, is going to predominate. And Eichenbaum, in this culture, will be using such a word advisedly, almost familiarly. But at the same time, it's very interesting that the kind of science he's thinking about is not just any science. You'll see this more and more clearly as you read through the text and as we talk about it. It's Darwinian science. And it's very interesting that Darwin, as much as Marx, is all about struggle. The struggle for survival, the struggle for dominance, and notice the important, and we'll come back to it, the importance of the word dominant, the dominant, in the thinking of the Russian formalist, the struggle for dominance among species in a habitat. So in literature, you have something like, if you think in terms of literary evolution, as Yuri Tinyanov does in the essay that the passage on your sheet ends, if you think in those terms, you think about literary history itself as a sequence of changes in which devices, aspects of the literary text, struggle for dominance within and over against other devices. And so it is simultaneously, in his very first sentence, a Marxist and a Darwinian vocabulary. that Eichenbaum is invoking. And that's what partly accounts for the strenuousness of his rhetoric. You know, I mean, there is the backdrop of class struggle, which is understood as crucial. There is the fermentation of Darwinian thought, which at the same time is understood as crucial. A great deal is at stake. And if those disorganized, unsystematic academics aren't attuned to the importance of these struggles, right? Class struggle, the struggle for science, science as the science of struggle, if they aren't attuned to these currents, these contemporary currents, that's just another way of showing how irrelevant and obsolete they are. Now, the theory of the formal method, Eichenbaum's essay that you've read for today, was written in 1927. In other words, it was written directly in the aftermath of a bombshell published by Leon Trotsky called Literature and Revolution in 1926. Trotsky's Literature and Revolution is a brilliant book, an attack on many things, a defense of certain other things, but in particular, and very painfully, an attack on the formalists. Trotsky argues that the preoccupation with form in and for itself is a kind of aestheticism, something, by the way, which Eichenbaum denies during the course of his text, is a kind of aestheticism turning its back on history and turning its back precisely on class struggle. Trotsky is not simple-minded in his literary taste, and he doesn't just sort of spontaneously insist that everybody has to write socialist realism. That doesn't, by the way, happen until 1934, when it became a kind of pronouncement of necessity at the International Soviet Writers' Conference on that occasion. But in the meantime, it is a shot fired across the bow of those forms of aestheticism, quote unquote, which can be understood as self-involved, self-preoccupied, and indifferent to history and class struggle. It's 1927. Things are changing. It's been 10 years since the revolution. There is a kind of taking hold of society and government by increasingly bureaucratized and strict forms of surveillance and management of social matters. Whether and to what extent the Russian formalists and their allies, the futurists, among them Mayakovsky and others, felt a kind of antagonism or growing threat from the government is not wholly clear to me. It's been disputed, and one doesn't know for sure. I mean, there is still a tremendous amount of intellectual ferment and excitement in the capitals of Russia. This is not, this is not a wasteland of thought by any means. And the Russian formalists are an important part of what's going on. Nevertheless, Trotsky's book is a provocation. It's a challenge, and Eichenbaum's essay that you read for today is in part, to a degree that it can't really come out and talk about, doesn't want to come out and talk about it, a response to Trotsky's book. Now, there were, but obviously, he doesn't want to say anything about that. There's one way in which he does talk about it, and that is a marvelous exchange between the ethnographic critic Veselovsky and Shklovsky of 1917, which I'll return to. But for the most part, he stays away, seems at least to stay away from the provocation, and simply defends the right of the formalists to exist and the integrity of what they're doing. And the obvious enemies, and of course this is Eichenbaum's language, so one needn't wince away from using it. The obvious enemies in this case are figures like Potebna, who, the academician, who in a way defended the premises of the symbolists, the other very lively group of antagonists to the formalists, to the effect that poetry is all about imagery, that it's all about patterns of thought, in the case of the symbolists, thought arising from the unconscious and being reinforced by sound, by language, so that language is subsidiary to imagery and thought, a kind of handmaiden of it, the vessel, in other words, into which the energies of symbolic thought are poured. And it's this basic antagonism, this difference of opinion, that Eichenbaum wants to focus on, and indeed does focus on. But at the same time, there is a feeling, somehow there is a feeling, and it's very clear in an essay by Jakobson called "The Generation That Squandered Its Poets." There's a feeling of a kind, something like bureaucratization is taking hold, something like an atmosphere in which our perceptions of the things around us become automated. Shklovsky, in particular, is very much preoccupied with the sense of the automatization or automism, I much prefer the latter word, of perception. The way in which we no longer really see what's around us. I quoted the other day Wallace Stevens saying that poetry should make the visible a little hard to see. By the same token, Shklovsky insists, and his colleagues insist, that the business of the roughening of surface by means of various modes of literariness is to defamiliarize automated perceptions, to make us suddenly see again, see the nature of the language that we're using, and indeed also to see, and this is very clear, by the way, in the essay Literature as Technique in your anthology that I recommended that you read, but also at the same time to see the world itself anew by means of devices of language that tear the film away from our eyes. And so defamiliarization, against the backdrop of a kind of gray uniformity that Jakobson, in his essay on the generation that squandered its poets, called BYT, B-Y-T. I don't know how to pronounce that. I don't know a word of Russian, and so I actually try to avoid using the rather well-known Russian equivalents for these terms because I feel like an idiot. You know, I mean, yes, I see them in the text just as anybody else does, but since I don't really know what I mean except by means of the translation, why should I use them? But in any case, this is a well-known term used by Jakobson in this essay, which is, like all such terms that somehow wander into other languages, is difficult to translate. That's why they wander into other languages. But it means something like a kind of dulled grayness or ordinariness of life. And it's against that backdrop, it's that sense of bureaucratized existence that defamiliarization has, to a certain extent, the ideological purpose of dispelling and undermining. One has to recognize, in other words, that this motive, that this motive force stands behind the work of the Russian formalists, so that the claim to be strictly scientific needs to be hedged a little bit as a return of the aesthetic or a return of value, understood as the insistence that life doesn't need to be all that dull. That really is implicit in the Russian formalist viewpoint. Literariness, then. What is literariness? It is those aspects of a text, the way in which those devices of a text that call themselves to our attention are new. That is to say, the way in which they shake up perception in the fact that we're not used to seeing them. And in a way, this call for that which is new is worldwide. At the same time, you have Ezra Pound among the high modernists in the West saying, make it new, as his slogan. You have the various observations of Eliot and Joyce and others that I cited last time in talking about the background to the new criticism, all of them insisting on the necessity of difficulty, of novelty, of coming to terms with the immediacy of one's particular circumstances, getting away from that which is familiar and ordinary and vague. It is a transnational idea, in other words, which nevertheless has obviously certain specific applications depending on where it is. The newness that the Russian formalists are interested in is not just any newness. It has to do particularly with the palpable or roughened form of that which defamiliarizes. Now, how do we understand this form? Form as opposed to what? This is a crucial issue for the Russian formalists, which they handle very boldly. Part of their platform is that everything is form. There's no distinction, in other words, between form and content. That's the fundamental mistake, as they see it, that their enemies of various kinds make in their understanding, in their approach to literature. But, you know, their own basic distinctions are dualistic, aren't they? The distinction between poetic and practical language, the distinction between plot and story, the distinction between rhythm and meter. In all of these cases, you know, you're tempted to say, well, gee, one of those must be form and the other must be content. In particular, obviously, plot and story, where plot is the constructedness of the text and the story is what the text is about. Doesn't that sound a lot like form and content? Well, I actually think the Russian formalists can be defended against the charge that, unbeknownst to themselves, they fall back into form-content distinctions by insisting on this variety of dualities. And I want to spend a little time suggesting, developing the way in which that defense could be undertaken. Poetic and practical language. You've already been hearing this in A. Richards and in the New Critics, and they, in a way, do, while the New Critics, in a variety of ways, insist that form is meaning, form is content, and so on. They're still not really breaking down the distinction between form and content, and there's an obvious sense in which they understand poetic language to be that in which form is predominant, and practical language to be that in which content is dominant. But the Russian formalists see it in a slightly different way. Content is a function, or let me say, practical language, the purpose, in other words, of communicating facts, of communicating at all, which we associate with practical language, is a function of poetic language. That is to say, it coexists with poetic language. It is an aspect of a text, the way in which it does communicate, in other words, which has to be understood as existing in a dynamic, functional relationship with those aspects of the text in which literariness is dominant. It's not a question, in other words, of poetry or of a novel being somehow or another strictly a matter of poetic language. In poetry or the novel, you can argue that the poetic function, and this is the term Jakobson will ultimately use for it in his essay, Linguistics and Poetics, you can argue that the poetic function is the dominant. But that's not to say that practical language is absent or that it doesn't have its own function. So, and this, by the way, if we begin by talking about poetic and practical language, we're beginning where the Russian formalists began. As Eichenbaum explains, in 1914, the first publication of their journal was entirely devoted to poetic sound. That is, to the way in which sound seems, indeed is, not just subservient to the elaboration of sense. One of the things, by the way, the formalist that Eichenbaum does in passing is remind us that we should be on our guard against thinking that sound is onomatopoetic. That is, that it reflects the meaning of what it's talking about. When I say pigeon, I don't really seem to have any particular sense of an onomatopoetic word, but if I use the Latin pipio, all of a sudden I say, oh, that's onomatopoetic. Well, the formalists and also Saussure, this is one of the most important links between the formalists and Saussure, are very carefully on their guard against supposing that sound, that the ways in which we hear language is onomatopoetic, because that would suggest, once again, in keeping with symbolist ideas, that sound was subservient to meaning. The importance of the earliest work of the Russian formalists was the establishment of the idea that sound goes its own way and is not subservient to anything, that it is a device independent of, though interacting with other devices, and that it doesn't exist for the purpose of elucidating anything. In fact, it exists amazingly in order to hinder understanding in the kinds of texts that we're inclined to call poetic. It's repetitive, it's anti-economical, it's retardant. Language of this source is a device. And in relation to other devices, it's called a function. We call it a function. That is to say, it has a function. It has a function within our understanding of the way in which a text has structure. Every aspect of the structure of the text can be understood as having a function. The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. Now, this is an example of a text in which alliteration is plainly predominant. It is repetitive. We understand it to be somehow different from the ordinary way in which a fact is communicated. But if we are not Russian formalists, we're tempted to say, well, you know, it's a mnemotechnic device introduced for the purpose, that is to say, subservient to the communication of a fact. By the way, I've never known whether it is a fact. But a lot of mountains are rainy. Pyrenees, I suppose, are dry. I really have no idea whether it's a fact. But, and it's not important in My Fair Lady whether it's a fact. What's important in My Fair Lady is to repeat the repetitiousness of verse. The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain, in terms of the tautology of the plot. Eliza Doolittle tries repeatedly to say that. But just like Nito and Speedy failing or being unwilling to push Tony out of his problem, so Eliza repeatedly says the Rhine in Spain falls mainly on the plain, and that's not good enough. And so the repetition in the plot reinforces the repetition of the sound in question. And whether or not it's a fact is completely immaterial to Eliza, it's completely immaterial to Henry Higgins, and it's completely immaterial to the outcome of My Fair Lady. What's important in My Fair Lady is the functionality of repetition in the transformation of a principal character into a lady. Right? That is, and so in formalist terms, that's the way we have to understand what, if we weren't formalists, we would suppose, as I say, to be a mnemotechnical device for the purpose of communicating something about the weather in Spain. Right? And I think it's interesting to think in those terms about the relationship among devices. Now, the point is that yes, and this is what emerged from subsequent thought in the Russian formalist movement. First wave or phase had to do strictly with sound. But then they began to say, well, what about this notion of device? What about the way in which maybe the best thing to do, if we're going to avoid keeping once and again and again and again falling into the trap of making one aspect of the text subservient to other aspects, merely there for the purpose of reinforcing content. If we're going to avoid doing this, if we're going to see the text as a text that has a structure, hadn't we better say that everything in it is form, that everything in it is a device? How are we going to do that? Because it would certainly seem that texts refer to things. Well, yes, they do. So why don't we call that to which they refer, for example, in the case of socialist realism, or indeed realism of any kind, why don't we call that to which they refer the society function? Why don't we say, oh yeah, in a certain kind of text, the dominant device in that text is referentiality, is the way in which the real world is hooked onto. And that can be understood as a device with respect to other devices. It becomes, at certain moments in the evolution of forms, according to the Russian formalists, the dominant. You see, this is the way in which you avoid the form-content distinction. You say, oh, so-called content, what other people call content, is a device like any other. And it engages in the struggle for dominance with all the other devices that one can identify as aspects of literature. Take the distinction between plot and story. I mean, there you would really think the formalists are on thin ice. Plot, yes, we all agree that's the constructedness of the story. That's the way the story is put together, how the overcoat is made, and so on. But story, that's what the plot is about. And if that's what the plot is about, how can we avoid calling it content? Well, it's very interesting. In the first place, notice that sometimes story can be the dominant in obviously formal terms. I think of that story that all of you probably read in school, The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. It's a list of the contents of the knapsack of a soldier during the Vietnam War. Just a list of the contents. And of course, all these items in the knapsack are evocative, and what they do is they suggest a plot. By the end of the story, in other words, there is implied a plot. It's just the opposite of the usual relationship between plot and story. Ordinarily, a plot constructs something which is implied. That is to say, that which happens, that which we can talk about in paraphrase or as something, as a subject matter outside the text. But here, in O'Brien's story, you're given the subject matter. And the subject matter itself becomes the dominant device. And it implies, in your imagination, a way to construct it. But the way to construct it is not the dominant. The way to construct it is something that's up to you. What's the dominant in the text is just the stuff in his knapsack, listed with as little implication as possible. And so that's an instance of the way in which you can see the relationship between plot and story as a relationship of devices, even though it's awfully tempting to say, oh, the story is just the content and the plot's the form. But no, the formalists don't want to keep that distinction for the reasons that I've been trying to develop. Any device can be the dominant at a given moment in the development of literary history. Any device can be the dominant. In Hiawatha, Longfellow's Hiawatha, meter is the device. Da, 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 da. You know how it goes. In Tennyson, sound is the device. The murmurous haunt, oh, I have no memory at all today. I'm mixing it up with a line of Keats, and I'm going to say something else about Keats. So I'll just tell you that Sellers thought the two most beautiful words in the English language were cellar door. And that was his preoccupation in the making of poetry. So that we can say that the dominant device in Tennyson's poetry, as in much Victorian poetry, certainly Swinburne's, is sound. And in Keats, we can say that the dominant device is imagery, his famous emphasis on synesthesia and the way in which the various senses merge in the evocation of images. In other words, of course, the academicians and the symbolists were obsessed with imagery. That's not to say that a Russian formalist can't deal with imagery. In a certain poet, the image, the image patterns can certainly be recognized as the dominant device. That would probably be the case, for example, with Keats. In Gertrude Stein, the dominant is repetition, undoubtedly. And in Wordsworth or Joyce or Woolf, the dominant is perhaps not formal. Think of the feeling of that Wordsworth's blank verse just kind of disappears into prose. I don't think that's quite true, but there's a general feeling that, as Matthew Arnold said, Wordsworth has no style. In Wordsworth or Joyce or Woolf, the dominant is the interiority of consciousness. That is to say, the way in which what we call stream of consciousness or the inwardness of thought motivates. This is another word that you encounter in Eichenbaum's essay, motivates everything else that goes on in the text. In other words, an enormous variety of aspects of literature, understood as literariness, can become the dominant. Now, as soon as we start talking about things like the dominant, we are also aware of the evanescence of dominance. What is culinary in one generation, and here I'm alluding to a passage quoted by Eichenbaum, what's culinary in one generation, for example, the devices of crime fiction, in the work of Dostoevsky become absolutely central. He's thinking primarily of Crime and Punishment, but this is true of other works of Dostoevsky as well, so that the devices of the dime detective novel actually then become the motivating dominant of a mainstream literary form. But then they, in turn, run their course and are replaced by some other dominant. In other words, once you start thinking about the evanescence of dominance, you're also thinking about literary history. One of the most false charge, and it was a charge leveled by Trotsky among many others against the Russian formalists, is that they ignore history. The same charge so often leveled against the new critics. They don't at all ignore history. Almost from the beginning, but increasingly during the 20s, they turned their attention to the problems of literary historiography. And they said some rather bracing things about it. In your text on page 012, the left-hand column, I'll keep referring to those stamped numbers the left-hand side of your text, we find Eichenbaum evoking an exchange of opinion between the ethnographic critic Veselovsky and Victor Shklovsky. Shklovsky, he said, third of the way down, had encountered Veselovsky's formula, a formula broadly based on the ethnographic principle that the purpose of new form is to express new content. New content, in other words, being those social and historical and environmental forces that oblige literary techniques to change. That's the ethnographic position. That's the word used. It is obviously also the materialist or social position. History produces literature. And not just literary history, but social history produces literature. Shklovsky disagreed. And he decided to advance a completely different point of view. The work of art arises from a background of other works and through association with them. The form of a work of art is defined by its relation to other works of art, to forms existing prior to it. Not only parody, by the way, is a very, very broad term in Russian formalist thought, in a way simply meaning change. That is to say, the way in which one text inevitably riffs on another text in elaborating its own devices and emphases and in search of a new kind of dominance. Not only parody, but also any kind of work of art is created parallel to and opposed to some kind of form. The purpose of new form is not to express new content, but to change an old form which has lost its aesthetic quality. That is to say, lost its power to defamiliarize, lost its power to take the film away from our eyes. Now this, it really, I mean, as you think about it, you say to yourself, you know, that's all very bracing and daring, but Veselovsky is right. We know literature is produced by historical forces. What does it mean, you know, a new form comes about only to replace an old form which has ceased to be aesthetically viable? How does that happen? You know, I mean, the old form, it's you know, you've got to appeal to social forces if you're going to talk about change. That really does seem to me to be the spontaneous conclusion we want to draw. That's why I gave you the extraordinary passage on your sheet for the end of Tynyanov's On Literary Evolution, written also 1927, written also, in other words, in response to Trotsky's Literature and Revolution. This is what Tynyanov says. In formalist historiography, the prime significance of major social factors is not at all discarded. In other words, we're not just playing a game here. We too understand the relevance of what we call the society function. Rather, it must be elucidated in its full extent through the problem of the evolution of literature. This is in contrast to the establishment of the direct influence of major social factors. And this is the amazing part of this utterance, which I think is truly remarkable, which the major social the influence of major social factors, which replaces the study of evolution of literature with the study of the modification of literary works, that is to say, their deformation. You see the distinction. In natural selection, certain things happen. There is mutation. New genes emerge as dominant, no longer recessive or latent. And organisms change. That's evolution. But organisms change against a backdrop. You know, organisms changing like crazy. In comes the prehensile thumb, and the next thing you know, you get a colossal earthquake. And the possessor of the prehensile thumb disappears from the earth, which is to say, very possibly, the human species will never develop. That's the modification of a form. And it strikes me that it's a remarkable distinction. You will get, in any period, spontaneously, the sorts of impulses that bring about socialist realism. But if you have a ukase from above telling you that if you're going to write, it has to be socialist realism, that's a modification. That is the modification of what would and does evolve in and of itself within an understanding of literary historiography. The distinction, it seems to me, compelling. The only objection to be made to it, perhaps, indeed, is that much of the time it's just more trouble than it's worth to enforce it. I mean, it would drive us into such baroque circumlocutions and avoidances of the obvious to say, oh, social factors have nothing to do with this, that we might as well just sort of not give the distinction up, because I think it's very important always to have it in the back of our minds. It's important in Darwinian terms to have it in the back of our minds. And that's what Tynyanov is insisting on. That's why he calls his essay on literary evolution. Not literary revolution, but literary evolution. And I think it's terribly important to keep the distinction in the back of our minds, even if we find it in practical terms well nigh impossible, possibly even in many contexts a waste of time to be perpetually enforcing it. It is nevertheless a distinction that does exist, once you think about it, that deserves to exist and deserves to be remembered when we think about the variety of ways in which literary history can be written. Now, I'm going to stop there. Time's up. There's a little more to say, I think, and certainly the possible ways in which Russian formalism is subject to critique need quickly to be passed in review. We'll do all this next time before we get into